Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. The Father willed to give us birth by the word of truth, that we may be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Hallelujah. Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus proposed a parable to the crowds. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a person took and sowed in the field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, yet when full grown, it is the largest of plants. It becomes a large bush, and the birds of the sky come and dwell in its branches. He spoke to them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed with 3 measures of wheat flour until the whole batch was leavened. All these things Jesus spoke to the crowds in parables. He spoke to them only in parables to fulfill what had been said through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will announce what was laid hidden from the foundation of the world. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. So today is the feast of St. Ignatius of Loyola. And St. Ignatius of Loyola was the founder of the Jesuits, perhaps the greatest religious order, or one of the greatest religious orders in church history. The Jesuits were kind of like the Navy SEALs of the church for a long time. So much so that even in the midst of the church, unfortunately, they had to deal with a lot of jealousy from other religious orders and other people in the church. At one point, the Jesuits were actually suppressed in many different areas of the world. But the Jesuits were basically the greatest missionaries. They became the greatest scholars. Right? The Jesuits, their main philosophy was for the greater glory of God, ad majorem Dei gloriam, right? For the greater glory of God. And so they wanted to save souls. So they went throughout the world as missionaries. But not only did they do missionary work, but they also wanted to be the greatest scholars, right? To give greater credence to the faith. And so many of the greatest scientists and scholars in the modern age were actually Jesuit priests, or at the very least educated in a Jesuit institution. The Jesuits, in many ways, were the driving force of the church after the tragedy of the Protestant rebellion, right? When the church became divided, right, in so many places throughout the world, it was Jesuit missionaries who actually went throughout the pagan world and began to convert people to the faith. So many areas in Central and South America, right, for example, were so devoutly Catholic. Places like the Philippines and others, right? So much of it was because of Jesuit missionaries. And the Jesuit missionaries were very dedicated and rugged as well. Being a Jesuit missionary was an extremely tough task. If you want to learn about that, read about the North American martyrs, right, and their experience. What's very interesting about the Jesuits, and this is what I wanted to focus on today, is that the Jesuits, they had kind of an interesting beginning. The Jesuits, they had their beginning in Paris, and it's not a very well-known pilgrimage destination. When I was in college seminary, I was actually able to go to Paris when I was studying abroad in Rome, and I was able to see the chapel, but it's not really a common destination for pilgrimages or anything like that. It's a tiny little chapel in the basement of a church. And in that basement, the Jesuits took their first vows with one another. I can never remember the exact number. It was 7 or 9, right? One of those two. And it was a small group of men, and basically what they decided to do was to found this Jesuit order, and they were going to be missionaries. And their first task, they wanted to go to the Holy Land. They wanted to convert the Muslims. And they knew that by going to the Holy Land, it was very likely that martyrdom would be their ultimate fate. And yet they pledge themselves to this task. The other thing they did was they actually pledged themselves to obedience to the Holy Father. So the Holy Father had other plans for them, and so they ended up going elsewhere. But all of this was St. Ignatius's main idea. He was the founder. He was the leader of this brotherhood. And the Jesuits, with that small group of men, they did so much good for the church. The Jesuits, you might say, were the main pillar of the Catholic Reformation, right? After the tragedy of the Protestant Reformation. The Jesuits did so much good for the church, and it was this small group of men completely dedicated to the mission. It was these small group of men who had a magnanimous vision. St. Ignatius, one of the things that's interesting when you read his writings, right? So many times when we think about sanctity, we think about humility. Right? When you read the writings of St. Ignatius, obviously he was a humble man, but he wasn't primarily focused on humility. He wanted to be a great saint. He wanted to be a legendary saint. He wanted to do great things for God and to be remembered and to achieve glory. There's something that all of us should desire in that. All of us should desire great glory and sanctity. Are we truly magnanimous in our zeal for sanctity? Are we magnanimous in our zeal for the mission? In so many churches, so many people look at the faith as just a bunch of moral precepts. It's just a bunch of rules to be obeyed. And we are to be well-behaved people. That's not what Christianity is about at all. It is about the mission of converting the world. Every parish has how many people in it? St. Bernard, we have about 350 families. That means we have about 1,000 people that come here. Imagine if only 7 of us could have the kind of dedication that these initial Jesuits had. Imagine what we could do in our county and throughout the world. But the problem is that so often as Catholics, our vision is too small. It's too narrow. It's too unoriginal and just like everybody else. We should be asking God to fill us with a fire of magnanimity and zeal like these young Jesuits had.